The old cabin looked abandoned from the road. But Ranger kept at the same spot behind the frozen woodshed like something down there still mattered. Rainwater dripped off the porch roof while Walter Hayes shoved the old woodshed door open with one tired shoulder. Ranger was already there, frozen breath rolling from his muzzle, barking low, focused on one loose plank buried beneath years of dirt and sawdust. Walter could still hear the wind pushing through Bitterroot Ridge behind him when the dog suddenly stopped growling and started digging harder. What do you think Ranger smelled under that cabin floor? Rain tapped against the apartment window long before sunrise. Not hard, just steady enough to keep a man awake. Walter sat at the kitchen table in his thermal shirt, staring at a cold cup of coffee beside an ashtray he hadn't used in years. The apartment smelled faintly of wet denim, motor oil, and dog fur. A small place over an old tire shop on the edge of Missoula. Cheap enough for a man trying not to fall behind. Ranger lay near the front door with his head on his paws. One ear lifted every time tires hissed through the wet street outside. Walter checked the clock again. 4:13 a.m. No point trying to sleep anymore. He rubbed both hands over his face, then stood slowly. His knees cracked when he moved. 57 years old, and every cold morning felt like somebody tightening bolts inside his joints. The floor heater rattled suddenly. Walter flinched before he could stop himself. Ranger looked up immediately. "I'm good," Walter muttered. The dog kept watching him anyway. Walter crossed to the sink and poured the coffee out. Dark water spiraled down the drain while rain slid down the window behind him. Somewhere downstairs, a metal garage door slammed shut. That did it. His shoulders tightened instantly. His eyes moved to the window, then the hallway, then back to the door. Old habits, the kind that never fully left. By 6:30, he was driving through gray streets toward the lumber yard outside town. Ranger sat in the passenger seat of the old Ford pickup, nose near the cracked heater vent. The truck coughed every time Walter hit a stoplight. Yeah, he muttered to it, still breathing. The lumber yard looked the same as always. Stacks of wet timber, muddy gravel. Men in hooded jackets carrying coffee thermoses through the rain. Walter had worked maintenance there almost 8 years, long enough to become invisible. He clocked in without speaking much and headed toward the back shop. Halfway there, a forklift dropped a pallet too hard against concrete. The bang echoed across the yard. Walter stopped cold. For 1 second, he wasn't in Montana anymore. Heat, dust, shouting over comms. His breathing changed before he realized it. "Walter?" The voice snapped him back. Gary Milton, the shift supervisor, stood beside the tool cage, holding a clipboard. "You all right?" Walter blinked once. "Yeah." Gary didn't answer right away. That silence told him everything. The conversation happened 10 minutes later, inside the cramped office near the loading dock. Gary kept rubbing his thumb along the edge of the clipboard, like he didn't want to be there either. "You missed 3 shifts this month," he said carefully. "And last week you left the pressure valve open on line 2. Walter stared at the stained floor tiles. "I fixed it." After Tommy caught it, rain drummed on the office roof. Gary sighed. "Look, nobody's mad at you, but the owners are nervous. Insurance already asked questions." Walter leaned back slowly in the chair. "So that's it." "I tried, Walt." The room stayed quiet. Finally, Walter nodded once and stood up. No yelling, no argument, just tired. Gary handed him an envelope with his final check inside. "I'm sorry." Walter slipped it into his jacket pocket without looking at it. Outside, Ranger was already waiting in the truck, watching through the windshield. The dog always knew. Walter climbed inside and shut the door harder than he meant to. Ranger nudged his elbow once. Guess we're retired now, Walter said quietly. The dog rested his head against Walter's arm. For a while they just sat there, listening to rain hit the roof of the truck. Back at the apartment, Walter carried a cardboard box upstairs filled with old gloves, tools, and a framed photo he hadn't looked at in years. Him in uniform beside 3 other Marines. Young faces, sunburned smiles. 2 of those men never made it home. Walter shoved the frame deep into the closet before he could think about it longer. His phone rang around noon. Unknown number. He almost ignored it. "Mr. Walter Hayes?" a woman asked. "Depends who's asking. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm calling from Bennett and Rowe Legal Services in Hamilton." Walter sat slowly at the kitchen table again. "Okay. I'm sorry to inform you that your grandmother, Eleanor Hayes, passed away 3 weeks ago." The apartment went very still. Walter looked toward the rain-covered window. He hadn't heard Eleanor's name in over 15 years. "Mr. Hayes? Yeah, I'm here. She listed you as sole beneficiary of her property on Bitterroot Ridge. There's paperwork requiring your signature." Walter let out a dry breath through his nose. "A cabin," he muttered. "Excuse me?" "Nothing," the lawyer explained details about keys, property taxes, and documents waiting at the office. Walter barely listened. All he could picture was an old mountain road disappearing into trees. He remembered cold mornings there as a kid. Pine smoke. A woman humming softly while making soup. Then nothing after that. His mother stopped taking him up there 1 year and never explained why. "Would you like us to prepare the property for sale?" the lawyer asked gently. Walter looked at the leaking stain spreading across his apartment ceiling. "Probably," he said. Ranger lifted his head immediately. Walter glanced at him. "It's just an old cabin," he added. The dog stood slowly. Then Ranger walked toward the kitchen counter, where the paperwork box now sat. He stopped beside it, staring, not barking, not growling, just watching it with complete focus. Walter frowned. "What?" Ranger didn't move. Rain rolled harder against the windows. Walter crossed the room and opened the box. Inside sat a small bundle of documents tied with faded string. Property records, tax papers. One old photograph clipped beneath them. Eleanor Hayes standing outside a cabin beneath heavy snow. Walter barely recognized her. "You always were stubborn," he muttered under his breath. Ranger kept staring at the box. Something about it unsettled Walter more than he wanted to admit. He looked away first. That night's sleep never really came. Walter sat in the dark living room around 2 in the morning with Ranger asleep beside the couch. The television flickered silently while headlights moved through rain outside. Every so often, Walter checked the parking lot through the blinds. Old reflexes again. At nearly 3, Ranger suddenly lifted his head, not barking, alert. Walter turned toward the window. A man stood across the street near the laundromat sign, still, watching the apartment building. Walter couldn't make out his face through the rain. After a few seconds, the man turned and disappeared into the dark. Walter stayed by the window long after he was gone. By sunrise, the decision was made. He would drive up to Bitterroot Ridge, see the cabin, sell it, and leave the mountain behind for good. At least that was the plan. Ranger watched silently as Walter began packing the truck. There wasn't much to take. A duffel bag, extra socks, a toolbox, dog food. An old sleeping bag rolled tight with faded straps. Walter moved through the apartment slowly, like a man packing up somebody else's life. Rain still hung over Missoula when they left town. The mountains ahead looked washed out and cold beneath low gray clouds. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat the entire drive, eyes fixed on the road ahead, like he already knew where they were going. Walter drove with one hand on the wheel. The heater barely worked. Every few miles he rubbed his shoulder, where an old injury always stiffened during bad weather. By noon, the city disappeared behind them. Road signs grew smaller, gas stations farther apart, pine trees thicker. Bitterroot Ridge waited somewhere beyond the fog. Walter stopped once outside a tiny roadside diner near Derby, mostly truckers inside. Old men in hunting caps nursing coffee under mounted elk heads. Ranger stayed in the truck while Walter grabbed food to go. When he came back out, he paused beside the driver's door. A dark green pickup sat across the gravel lot, engine running. The driver wore one sunglasses even under the clouds. Walter couldn't see his face clearly. After a second, the truck pulled away toward the highway without stopping. Walter watched it disappear. "Probably nothing," he muttered. Ranger rested his chin on the window frame. The road narrowed after that. Wet curves, sharp drop-offs, patches of old snow buried beneath the trees where sunlight never reached. Walter kept checking the mirrors without meaning to. Habit. Always habit. By late afternoon, the truck climbed onto a rough dirt road, barely wide enough for two vehicles. Branches scraped both sides of the ford with long, screeching sounds. Ranger finally stood, his ears lifted. "You smell something?" Walter asked. The dog gave a quiet whine. The cabin appeared suddenly through the trees. Walter slowed the truck to a crawl. There it was, exactly where memory had left it. A narrow wood cabin tucked against the ridge beneath tall pines. Smoke pipe crooked. Porch sagging slightly on one side. Snowmelt dripping steadily from the roof. But it wasn't abandoned. That hit Walter first. Someone had cleared the walkway recently. Firewood sat stacked beside the porch under a tarp. One window had fresh plastic covering a crack. Walter killed the engine. Silence rushed in around them. No traffic, no voices, just wind moving through the trees. Ranger jumped down first and circled the clearing slowly with his nose low. Walter stood beside the truck staring at the cabin. For a second, he remembered being 8 years old. Sitting on those porch steps holding a bowl of tomato soup while Eleanor hummed something inside. The memory vanished as quickly as it came. He grabbed the keys from his pocket and climbed the porch. The front door stuck halfway before finally groaning open. Cold air rolled out. The inside smelled like cedar, dust, and old stone fireplaces. Walter stepped in carefully. The cabin was small. One main room, tiny kitchen, narrow hallway leading toward 2 bedrooms, furniture covered with old sheets except for one rocking chair near the window. That chair wasn't covered. It looked used recently. Walter frowned at it. Lawyer said she passed 3 weeks ago. Ranger padded through the room slowly, nails clicking against wood floors. Walter checked the back rooms automatically. Windows, locks, closets, exits. Clear. He hated that his brain still worked that way. The generator outside coughed to life after 3 tries. Weak lights flickered overhead. "Good enough," Walter muttered. He spent the next hour opening windows and sweeping dust while Ranger moved in and out of the cabin. The dog kept drifting toward the back of the property, toward the old shed. Each time Walter called him back, Ranger returned reluctantly. By evening, the temperature dropped fast. Walter heated canned stew on the stove, while snow flurries spun outside the windows. The cabin creaked constantly in the mountain wind. Ranger sat near the door instead of near the fire, watching. "Watcher, you're acting strange," Walter said. The dog didn't move. Later, Walter carried a lantern onto the porch with a cup of coffee in one hand. The ridge below disappeared into darkness. No town lights, no traffic, nothing but trees. A branch cracked somewhere far off. Walter froze automatically, listening. The sound didn't come again. Still, he stayed outside another minute, scanning the woods, before finally stepping back in. Ranger immediately walked to the rear window and stared toward the shed again. "What is it with you tonight?" The dog let out a low sound deep in his throat. Not aggressive, uneasy. Walter checked his watch. Almost midnight. He spread the sleeping bag near the fireplace instead of using the bedroom. Old instinct again. Better view of the door. The lantern burned low beside him while Ranger paced slowly through the cabin. Walter drifted in and out of shallow sleep for maybe an hour. Then came the sound. Metal striking metal somewhere outside. Sharp. Close. Walter sat upright instantly. Ranger was already standing at the door. Another clang echoed through the darkness. Walter grabbed the flashlight beside his bag. His pulse had changed now. Faster. Sharper. The cabin suddenly felt too small. He crossed quietly to the window and lifted the curtain edge with 2 fingers. Nothing. Only snow drifting sideways through the beam above the porch. Then another noise. This time from behind the cabin. Walter opened the door slowly. Cold air slammed into him. Ranger moved ahead first, body stiff. Walter swept the flashlight beam across the clearing. Trees, woodpile, truck, nothing else. But near the shed door, something metal swung lightly in the wind. An old chain hanging loose against the side wall. Clang, clang! Walter exhaled slowly. Jesus. Still, he walked the perimeter anyway, checking tracks, checking shadows. By the time he returned inside, sleep was gone completely. Morning arrived pale and icy. Walter stood at the sink, washing coffee grounds from a mug, while Ranger scratched suddenly at the back door. "Hold on." The dog pushed outside immediately and trotted straight toward the shed again. Walter followed, pulling his coat tighter against the cold. The shed leaned badly on one side now. Half the roof patched with rusted tin. Snow gathered around old fuel cans and broken tools near the entrance. Ranger slipped inside first, then stopped. His nose pressed against the dirt floor near the back wall. Walter stepped closer. "What'd you find?" The dog scratched hard at a loose section of old wooden planks nailed over part of the floor. Walter crouched slowly. The boards looked newer than the rest. Not recent, but newer. He knocked against one with his knuckles. Hollow. Ranger scratched harder. All right. All right." Walter grabbed a crowbar leaning against the wall and wedged it beneath the edge. The wood lifted with a dry crack. Beneath it sat a small metal box wrapped tightly in oilcloth, darkened with age. Walter stared at it without speaking. Ranger stepped back silently, eyes fixed on the box. Wind moved through the trees outside. Walter reached down slowly and brushed dirt from the lid. Something inside shifted softly. And for the first time since arriving on Bitterroot Ridge, Walter felt it clearly. The cabin wasn't empty. Not really. Somebody had left something behind waiting to be found. Walter carried the metal box back into the cabin with both hands. It was heavier than it looked. Oilcloth crackled softly as melted snow dripped from his sleeves onto the floorboards. Ranger followed close behind him. The dog never took his eyes off the box. Walter set it carefully on the kitchen table beneath the weak yellow light overhead. For a moment he just stood there staring at it. Then he grabbed a screwdriver from his toolbox. The lid resisted at first. Rust held on stubbornly around the edges. Finally it gave with a dull pop. A smell escaped immediately. Old paper, damp cedar, dust trapped for decades. Inside sat bundles of envelopes tied with faded blue ribbon, several black and white photographs, a small notebook swollen from age, and beneath everything else, folded neatly at the bottom, lay a child's wool scarf. Ranger lifted his nose toward it instantly. Walter picked up the scarf slowly. Tiny stitching lined the edge by hand. One corner still carried soot stains dark as charcoal. "What the hell happened up here?" he murmured. He laid the scarf aside and lifted the photographs next. Most showed groups of people standing outside the cabin. Men in heavy work coats. Women holding children bundled in blankets. Snow stacked shoulder-high around the porch. One picture stopped him cold. The cabin looked almost identical to now, except crowded with people. At least 20 of them. A handwritten note on the back read, "Winter of '74. Walter frowned. He remembered hearing something years ago about a fire near the old mines east of the ridge. Nothing more than fragments adults whispered about when they thought kids weren't listening. Ranger nudged another photograph off the table with his nose. Walter picked it up. This one showed Eleanor standing beside two little boys in oversized jackets. Her arm wrapped around both of them while snow blew sideways behind the group. She looked younger, tired, but not lonely. Walter leaned back slowly in the chair. All this time, the cabin creaked softly around him. Outside, wind swept through the trees with a hollow sound. He opened the notebook next. Most pages contained names, dates, short notes written in Eleanor's careful handwriting. Mrs. Delaney, medicine delivered. Cook family moved down valley before storm. Tom Griggs still coughing badly from smoke. Walter turned another page. Need more blankets before first freeze. The company won't help. His eyes stopped there. The company. No company name. No explanation. Just those words. Ranger suddenly let out a low huff and looked toward the window. Walter glanced outside automatically. Nothing moved beyond the glass except drifting snow. Still, he got up and checked the porch anyway. Old reflex. The clearing sat empty beneath gray skies. Pine trees swayed slowly along the ridge. No vehicles, no footprints besides his own and Ranger's. When he stepped back inside, Ranger was sitting beside the table again, watching the scarf. Walter picked it up one more time. Something about that tiny piece of fabric bothered him more than the rest. It made everything feel real, not history. People. By afternoon, the snow eased enough for Walter to drive into town. The place below Bitterroot Ridge barely qualified as a town anymore. One gas station, a feed store, small grocery, 2 bars, a church with peeling white paint. Walter parked beside a diner and pulled his coat tighter against the cold. Several locals looked up when he entered. That happened in small towns. New faces always got noticed. The waitress poured coffee without asking. "You staying up on the ridge?" she asked. Walter glanced at her name tag. "Linda. Just for a while." "You Eleanor's grandson?" The question surprised him. "Yeah." Linda nodded once, but didn't smile. "Haven't heard that name in years." Something in her tone made Walter pause. What kind of woman was she? The waitress looked toward the kitchen before answering. "Depends who you ask." Then she walked away. Walter sat with that answer a while. Later he stopped at the town hardware store for batteries and fuel stabilizer. The old man behind the counter kept staring at him during checkout. Finally he said quietly, "You staying in that cabin alone?" "With my dog." The man nodded toward Ranger waiting outside the window. "Good. Better that way." Walter frowned slightly. "Meaning?" The old man hesitated. Then another customer entered the store and the moment vanished. "Roads get rough up there this time of year," he muttered instead. Walter left unsettled. Near sunset he walked into the only bar still open on Main Street. Warm air rolled over him, carrying smells of fried onions, beer, and wet jackets. Conversation dipped briefly when he entered. Ranger stayed beside the door while Walter ordered coffee instead of whiskey. An older bartender wiped glasses behind the counter. "You Eleanor Hayes' boy." Walter almost corrected him. "Grandson." But something stopped him. "Yeah." The bartender studied him for a second too long. Then he leaned closer. Eleanor never told you why half this town hated her. The room suddenly felt quieter. Walter set his cup down slowly. No. The bartender nodded once like he'd expected that answer. Well, he said softly, maybe that's for the best. Before Walter could ask another question, a man at the far end of the bar called for another drink. The bartender stepped away, and nobody else in the room looked at Walter again. Darkness had settled over the mountains by the time he drove back toward the cabin. Snow reflected pale blue beneath the headlights. Ranger sat rigid beside him halfway up the ridge. Then the dog growled. Low. Walter slowed the truck immediately. What is it? Ranger stared toward the trees on the passenger side. Walter scanned the woods. At first he saw nothing, then movement. A figure standing deep between the pines, maybe 30 yards off the road. Still, watching. Walter hit the brakes hard. The headlights shifted. The figure disappeared instantly behind the trees. Walter grabbed the flashlight from the seat and stepped out into the freezing air. Hey! Only wind answered him. Ranger jumped down and sniffed near the roadside snowbank, pacing back and forth with tense shoulders. Walter swept the flashlight through the woods. Nothing. No footsteps, no voice, just endless trees. After a minute, he climbed back into the truck. Probably a hunter, he told himself. Probably. But his heartbeat hadn't slowed by the time the cabin came into view. Inside, he locked the door without thinking. Ranger immediately carried the soot-stained scarf from the table into the living room and laid down beside it near the fire. Walter watched him carefully. You guarding it now? The dog rested his head over the cloth. Walter sat heavily in the rocking chair near the window. The cabin groaned softly around him while darkness pressed against the glass outside. He looked at the notebook again, resting on the table. At the names, the dates, the photographs of frightened families standing in snow. And for the first time since arriving on Bitterroot Ridge, Walter realized something that unsettled him far more than the stranger in the woods. Eleanor hadn't hidden those things because they were worthless. She hid them because they mattered. Walter stayed awake long after midnight, staring at the notebook spread across the kitchen table. Ranger slept near the fire with the child's scarf tucked beneath one paw like it belonged there. Snow drifted steadily outside. The cabin felt different now. Smaller somehow, full of voices that weren't there anymore. Walter rubbed tired eyes and read through the names again. Delaney, Griggs, Mercer, Holcomb. Some names had small marks beside them. Moved south, found work. Lost husband in fire. He stopped there. Lost husband in fire. Not mine collapse, not accident. Fire. The wind rattled the windows hard enough to make him glance toward the door again. Old reflex. Always waiting for bad news to walk in. By morning, the snowfall had stopped. Bitter cold settled over the ridge under a pale gray sky. Walter fed Ranger beside the porch while steam rose from their breath. You and me, he muttered, pouring coffee into a dented thermos. Guess we're historians now. Ranger wagged his tail once. Walter drove down into town again around noon. He wasn't sure what he was looking for anymore. Maybe answers. Maybe somebody willing to talk. The diner was quieter than the day before. Same waitress. Same tired country music humming through old ceiling speakers. This time, a man sitting alone near the window nodded toward Walter. That's Eleanor Hayes' grandson, ain't it? Walter paused. The man looked maybe 65. Dark beard gone mostly white. Heavy canvas jacket. Hands rough enough to belong to somebody who'd worked outdoors his whole life. Depends who's asking, Walter said. The man gave a faint smile. Miguel Torres. Walter slid into the booth across from him after a second. Ranger settled beside the table immediately. Miguel looked down at the dog. Smart eyes on him. He's smarter than me most days. Miguel laughed quietly at that. Up close, Walter noticed the veteran cap resting beside Miguel's coffee mug. Desert storm pin stitched near the brim. You served? Walter asked. Army. Miguel shrugged. Long time ago. Something unspoken passed between them after that. Veterans usually recognized each other before words caught up. Miguel nodded toward the window. You staying up on the ridge? For now. That place still standing surprises me. Walter leaned back carefully. People keep saying things like that? Miguel stared into his coffee for a moment before answering. Because folks around here spent years pretending that cabin never existed. The waitress brought fresh coffee without asking. Miguel waited until she walked away. After the mine fire in '74, he said quietly, families got stranded up there for weeks. Snow came early that year. Roads washed out. The company shut operations down fast and disappeared. Walter listened without interrupting. Some people lost homes, Miguel continued. Some lost husbands. A few lost everything. And Eleanor took them in? Miguel nodded slowly. That cabin was packed wall to wall. Women, kids, old men coughing smoke out of their lungs. Couple veterans, too. Guys couldn't find work after coming home. Walter looked down at Ranger. The dog rested calmly against his boot. Nobody talks about that now, Walter said. Because your grandma embarrassed people. Walter frowned. Miguel leaned closer. Town leaders wanted the whole thing quiet. Easier that way. Easier for business. Easier for the company lawyers. But Eleanor kept showing up at meetings asking where the aid money went. And people started calling her trouble. The diner door opened behind them, letting cold air sweep inside. A tall man in a dark coat stepped through carrying snow on his boots. Mid-50s maybe. Clean shave, expensive watch. His eyes landed on Walter immediately. Miguel noticed too. That there is Ben Calloway, he muttered. Ben approached the table with a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. You're Walter Hayes. Walter stood halfway out of habit. Yeah. Ben extended a hand. Ben Calloway. My family's got property near the ridge. Walter shook it carefully. Firm grip, controlled. Ben glanced toward the window where Walter's truck sat parked. You planning to stay up there long? Not sure yet. Well, Ben said, if you decide you don't want the hassle, I'd be interested in buying the cabin property. Walter blinked once. You came in here just to ask me that. Ben smiled slightly. Small town. News travels fast. Miguel watched silently from the booth. Walter crossed his arms. Why do you want it? Access road, mostly. Logging routes up that side of the ridge could help my company. Uh-huh. Ben reached into his coat and handed Walter a business card. Think it over. I'd make a fair offer. Then he nodded politely and walked back outside. Walter watched through the diner window as the man climbed into a silver SUV and drove away. Miguel let out a long breath. That's not a coincidence. What isn't? You showing up. Him showing up. Walter looked back at him. Miguel lowered his voice. Ben's father worked management at the mine back then. Silence settled over the booth. Outside, snow slid from the diner roof in heavy clumps. Walter finally asked, You think he's hiding something? Miguel shook his head slowly. No, I think everybody around here hid something. The words followed Walter the entire drive back to the cabin. By dusk, the sky had darkened again. Wind pushed through the pines harder now, carrying the smell of fresh snow. Walter unloaded groceries while Ranger circled the clearing. The dog suddenly froze near the tree line. Ears up, tail stiff. Walter stopped moving. What is it? Ranger let out one sharp bark toward the woods. Walter followed his gaze. At first he saw nothing. Then movement between the trees. Somebody standing there, far enough away to hide in shadow. Walter stepped forward instinctively. "Hey!" The figure moved immediately, gone within seconds. Branches snapped deeper in the woods. Ranger barked again, louder this time. Walter felt that familiar tightness crawl into his chest. The old deployment feeling. The sense of being watched before contact. He hated how fast his body remembered it. He grabbed the flashlight from the truck and swept the beam across the tree line. Nothing. Just snow falling through dark branches. Slowly, Walter backed toward the porch. "Inside," he said quietly. Ranger obeyed, but kept glancing toward the woods. Walter locked the cabin door behind them and checked the windows one by one. The fire crackled softly, while darkness swallowed the ridge outside. Ranger refused to leave the front room that night. Every creak made his ears twitch. Every gust of wind pulled Walter farther from sleep. Near midnight, Walter stood at the window, with one hand resting against the curtain edge. The clearing looked empty, but something told him it wasn't. And deep down, for the first time since coming back to Bitterroot Ridge, Walter realized this story wasn't buried nearly as deep as people wanted him to believe. Snow fell hard overnight. By dawn, Bitterroot Ridge looked buried under white silence. Pine branches sagged beneath the weight. The truck sat half-covered beside the porch, and frost crept thick along the cabin windows. Walter barely slept. Every small noise had dragged him awake. The groan of old wood, the scrape of branches against the roof. Once, sometime near 3 in the morning, Ranger had lifted his head and stared toward the back of the cabin for nearly 10 straight minutes without making a sound. That had been worse than barking. Walter stepped outside with a shovel and coffee steaming in his hand. The cold punched through his jacket instantly. Ranger moved ahead of him through the snow, then stopped. The dog lowered his nose near the side of the woodshed. Walter followed carefully. Fresh tracks. Not animal. Boot prints. His pulse tightened. The prints came from the tree line, circled the shed once, then disappeared back toward the woods. Walter crouched lower. Snow still looked soft around the edges. Recent, maybe hours old. Ranger gave a low growl. Walter scanned the ridge automatically. High ground, open sight lines, tree cover. The old habits never really died. "Somebody came up here last night," he muttered. He stood slowly and walked around the back of the cabin. That was when he saw the window. The lower corner had been pried just enough to leave splinter marks in the frame. Not broken. Tested. Walter touched the wood carefully. Cold. His jaw tightened. Nothing inside looked missing, but that somehow made it worse. Whoever came here hadn't wanted supplies. They wanted access. Back inside, Walter checked every room anyway. Closets. Pantry. Storage space under the stairs. Ranger stayed close beside him the entire time. By noon, snow clouds thinned enough for weak sunlight to slip through the trees. Walter climbed onto the shed roof with a hammer and spare shingles, after noticing loose metal rattling in the wind. The cold air burned his lungs. Halfway through the repair, Ranger started barking below. Sharp, focused. Walter looked down. The dog stood beside the far corner of the shed, scratching at packed snow near the foundation. "What now?" Ranger barked again. Walter climbed down carefully and grabbed a short pry bar from the toolbox. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he walked over. Part of the lower wall looked newer than the rest. Different nails. Different wood grain. Walter knelt beside it and shoved the pry bar under the board. The panel pulled free easier than expected. Inside sat another narrow compartment hidden between support beams. Walter stared at it silently. "Jesus, Eleanor." He reached in slowly. This time there was no metal box, only envelopes. dozens of them bundled together with faded twine. Some addressed to families in nearby counties, some never sealed at all. Walter carried the stack inside while Ranger followed close behind. The fire popped softly in the stove while snow drifted outside. Walter opened the first letter carefully. Dear Mrs. Griggs, the church basement has room again if the roads stay open. Please don't try to make the crossing alone with the boys. Another letter. Tom, I know pride matters, but winter matters more. Bring the children up here before the next storm. Another. Helen, I can't keep taking your food. You already gave too much. Walter stopped reading. The room suddenly felt heavier, not mysterious, human. Real people, real fear. Ranger rested beside the chair, while Walter opened another envelope near the bottom of the pile. This one wasn't addressed. It looked more like a journal entry, written quickly across lined paper. If one day somebody offers too much money for this place, don't trust the smile that comes with it. Walter frowned. He read the line again. If they suddenly need this land badly, it means they're still afraid of what happened here. No names, no explanation, just that warning. A gust of wind rattled the cabin hard enough to shake snow from the roof. Walter leaned back slowly. Ben Calloway's business card still sat on the kitchen counter where he'd left it. Ranger lifted his head toward the card immediately. The dog's ears twitched once. You don't trust him either, huh? Ranger stared at the counter without moving. Walter rubbed both hands over his face. His apartment in Missoula suddenly felt very far away. Back there, life had been small and numb and predictable. Work, bills, insomnia. Repeat. Up here, every answer uncovered another question, and somehow that frightened him less. Late afternoon settled dark and blue over the ridge. Walter carried firewood in from the porch while snow started falling again. Ranger remained outside longer than usual, pacing slow circles around the clearing. Then the dog froze. Walter noticed it instantly. Ranger stared downhill toward the narrow road winding through the trees. A truck engine echoed faintly somewhere below, not close, but climbing. Walter set the firewood down quietly. The sound faded after a minute, then silence again. No headlights appeared. No vehicle reached the clearing. Still, Ranger refused to relax. That night, Walter kept the flashlight beside his chair instead of near the bed. The old battery radio sat on the table, humming softly with static between stations. It reminded him of deployment nights overseas when silence felt worse than noise. Ranger lay directly in front of the door. Walter watched snowdrift past the windows while shadows shifted across the walls. You know what the crazy part is? He muttered quietly. Ranger's ears twitched. I came up here planning to sell this place in 2 days. The dog looked back at him. Walter gave a tired laugh under his breath. Yeah, that plan's dead. Close to midnight, a sudden metallic clank echoed from outside. Walter stood instantly. Ranger was already up. Both of them moved toward the window at the same time. Walter killed the lantern first. Darkness swallowed the cabin except for moonlight reflecting off snow. Another sound. Near the shed, Walter pulled the curtain edge aside just enough to see. Nothing moved at first. Then he caught it. A shadow slipping between the trees beyond the woodshed. Gone almost immediately. Ranger let out a deep warning growl. Walter's heartbeat hammered hard enough to bring back old memories he hated. Cold nights overseas, waiting for contact, never knowing who was out there watching. He forced himself to breathe slower. The figure never returned. But neither Walter nor Ranger slept much after that. Near dawn, Walter sat alone at the kitchen table, turning Eleanor's warning over in his mind again and again. If they suddenly need this land badly. Outside, snow continued falling over Bitterroot Ridge. Quiet, patient, like the mountain itself was waiting to see what Walter Hayes would do next. The storm finally broke 2 days later. Morning sunlight spilled across Bitterroot Ridge in pale silver bands, turning the snow bright enough to hurt Walter's eyes. Ranger stood at the porch rail, sniffing the cold air, while Walter loaded more wood beside the stove. Neither of them had rested much. The tracks around the shed had vanished beneath fresh snowfall, but the feeling hadn't. That stayed. Walter poured coffee into a travel mug and grabbed Eleanor's notebook from the table. He was done guessing. If people in town wanted the past buried, then the past probably mattered more than they admitted. By noon, he was parked outside the county library. The building sat between an insurance office and a boarded-up pharmacy downtown. Inside smelled like dust, old paper, and radiator heat. A woman with silver glasses looked up from behind the desk. "Can I help you?" Walter hesitated. "I'm looking for newspaper archives. Around 1974. Her expression shifted slightly. "What topic?" "The mine fire." Silence stretched a second too long. Then she nodded toward the back room. "Microfilm machine still works if you don't hit it." Walter spent nearly 2 hours scrolling through faded headlines while Ranger slept beneath the table beside him. Most articles were small: factory closures, road conditions, local basketball scores. Then he found it. Bitterroot mining facility suffers overnight fire. The article itself was barely half a page. Electrical malfunction suspected. Operation suspended indefinitely. No confirmed fatalities at this time. Walter frowned. That didn't match Eleanor's notebook or the photographs. He kept digging. 2 days later in the archives came another article buried near the back pages. Families displaced after worker housing damaged in fire. No mention of missing safety inspections. No mention of ignored complaints. No mention of people freezing through winter in Eleanor's cabin. Walter leaned closer to the screen. Then he spotted another name. Callaway Timber acquires access roads near abandoned mine property. Same year, same winter. "Of course," he muttered. Ranger lifted his head briefly at the sound of his voice. Walter copied several articles onto paper and folded them into his coat pocket. Outside, dusk settled early over town. Before heading back up the ridge, he stopped at the diner again. Miguel sat in the same booth as before, nursing black coffee. "You look like a man who found something," Miguel said. Walter slid into the seat across from him. "I found out the papers barely covered the fire." Miguel gave a dry laugh. Town would have preferred nobody remembered it at all. Walter pulled out the copied articles. "Makes no sense. Housing burns down. Families stranded all winter. Nobody talks about it?" Miguel stared quietly at the papers. Then he said, "People around here weren't rich. Most men worked that mine or depended on somebody who did." Walter listened. "When the company shut down," Miguel continued, "folks got scared. Angry too. But fear usually wins in places like this. Ben Calloway's family owned the timber roots nearby." Miguel nodded once. His father handled operations logistics for the mine toward the end. Walter leaned back slowly. "You think they covered up safety problems?" Miguel shrugged. "I think men trying to save money make dangerous decisions, and that's true everywhere." The honesty in that answer sat heavier than conspiracy ever could. Ranger suddenly stood beside the booth, ears up. Walter turned toward the window. A silver SUV rolled slowly past the diner. Ben Calloway sat behind the wheel. Their eyes met briefly through the glass before the SUV disappeared down the street. Miguel sighed softly. "He knows you're asking questions now." Walter stared after the vehicle. "Good." Darkness covered the ridge by the time Walter made it back to the cabin. Snow crunched under his boots while he carried groceries from the truck. Ranger moved ahead toward the woodshed. Then the dog barked hard. Once, twice. Walter dropped the grocery bag immediately. A figure burst from behind the shed and ran toward the trees. "Hey!" Walter sprinted forward without thinking. Old instincts hit before common sense could catch up. The man slipped in the snow and slammed against the side fence. Ranger lunged ahead, barking furiously. The stranger scrambled upright and bolted into the woods before Walter could reach him. Then Ranger yelped, sharp, painful. Walter froze. The dog limped back toward him, holding one front paw off the ground. Damn it. Walter knelt immediately. A shallow cut ran along Ranger's lower leg. Blood darkened the snow beneath him. Probably barbed wire near the fence line. Still, Walter's chest tightened hard at the sight. "You're okay," he muttered quickly. "You're okay, buddy." Ranger pushed against him despite the pain. 10 minutes later, Walter had the truck flying down the mountain road toward the emergency vet clinic outside town. Snow sprayed behind the tires. Ranger rested across the seat, breathing fast but steady, while Walter kept one hand against the dog's shoulder the whole drive. The clinic smelled like antiseptic and wet fur. An older veterinarian named Dr. Keller stitched the cut while Walter stood nearby trying not to pace. "Lucky dog," Keller said. "Another inch deeper would have needed surgery." Walter nodded stiffly. Ranger looked embarrassed more than hurt. Dr. Keller smiled faintly while wrapping the bandage. "He yours long. 7 years. Military dog?" Walter hesitated. "No shelter rescue after I got home." The vet glanced toward Ranger. "Funny how they rescue us right back." Walter didn't answer immediately, because the man wasn't wrong. While paying the bill, Walter overheard an older woman speaking quietly near the waiting room. "You know that cabin up on Bitterroot?" she asked another customer. Walter looked over. The woman noticed him and lowered her voice. "My cousin stayed there after the fire. Eleanor Hayes fed 23 people one winter out of that place." 23. Walter stood very still. The woman shook her head slowly. Town should have helped her more than they did. Then she gathered her purse and left before Walter could ask another question. The drive back felt quieter. Ranger slept most of the way home, despite the bandaged paw resting awkwardly on the seat. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the headlights. When the cabin finally appeared through the trees, Walter didn't see it the same way anymore. Not as property, not as a burden. He parked slowly and shut off the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Walter looked toward the dark outline of the porch. "She kept people alive up here," he whispered. Ranger opened tired eyes beside him. Walter rubbed the dog's neck gently. "And somebody still wants all traces of that gone." The wind moved softly through the pines. Somewhere far down the ridge, another engine echoed briefly through the darkness before fading away again. Walter listened until silence returned. Then he grabbed the papers from the passenger seat and headed inside with Ranger close beside him. For the first time in years, Walter Hayes no longer felt like a man waiting for life to end. He felt like somebody standing at the beginning of something dangerous. The mountain stayed quiet for nearly a week after Ranger got hurt. Too quiet. Walter hated that kind of silence most of all. Snow kept falling across Bitterroot Ridge in slow waves. Some mornings, the cabin disappeared completely behind curtains of white. Other days, the sky cleared just enough for sunlight to hit the frozen trees like broken glass. Ranger's leg healed slowly. The dog hated resting. Every time Walter turned around, Ranger was trying to limp, after him carrying firewood or checking the porch like nothing happened. "You're stubborn," Walter muttered one morning while changing the bandage. Ranger looked almost offended by the accusation. Walter laughed quietly under his breath. That sound still surprised him sometimes. Laughter. It hadn't lived in him much these last few years. Later that afternoon, Walter started clearing old storage beneath the staircase near the back hallway. The wood panels had warped from decades of mountain winters. Dust filled the air with every pry of the hammer. Ranger lay nearby watching closely. "You supervise now too?" Walter asked. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor. Walter pulled out old blankets first, then canned jars long expired. Finally, his fingers hit something solid behind the lower paneling. A hidden drawer. He froze. The compartment slid open slowly with a dry wooden scrape. Inside sat a cloth-bound journal wrapped carefully in wax paper. Walter stared at the faded handwriting across the cover. Eleanor Hayes. The room suddenly felt smaller. He carried the journal to the table carefully, like something fragile enough to collapse in his hands. Ranger limped over beside him immediately. Walter opened the first page. October 1974. The fire took the Johnson home tonight. 3 children sleeping in my guest room now. Oldest girl hasn't spoken a word since yesterday. Walter swallowed hard. He kept reading. Some entries were short. Others stretched pages long. The company says relief funds are delayed again. Mrs. Delaney cried while asking if I had extra boots for her youngest. Tom Griggs coughed blood into the sink this morning, but refuses a doctor because he cannot pay. Walter leaned back slowly. None of this sounded dramatic. That made it worse. It sounded real. Messy, exhausting, human. Outside, wind rattled the windows softly while daylight faded blue across the snow. Ranger rested his head against Walter's knee. Walter turned another page. I sold Mother's silver set today. Bought fuel oil and canned food with the money. Another page. My brother says I am wasting my life on strangers. Maybe he is right. But somebody has to care whether these people survive winter. Walter stopped there. His throat tightened unexpectedly. All his life he'd heard Eleanor described as difficult, reckless, bitter. Nobody ever mentioned this. Nobody mentioned she gave away nearly everything she owned trying to keep families alive. Hours passed without Walter noticing. Darkness settled fully outside. The fire burned low beside them. Ranger never moved from his side. Toward the back of the journal, Eleanor's handwriting grew shakier. The town council refused again. They say helping displaced veterans will attract more trouble to Bitterroot. Walter frowned at that line. A few pages later came another. I tried opening the cabin to traveling veterans this week. 2 stayed 3 nights. Quiet men. Broken in familiar ways. The town preacher warned me. People are starting to talk. Walter closed his eyes briefly. Broken in familiar ways. He understood exactly what she meant. The kind of silence veterans carried around after war. The way crowded rooms made your shoulders tighten without warning. The habit of checking exits before sitting down. Eleanor had seen it long before Walter ever wore a uniform. Ranger nudged his arm softly. Walter looked down at him. She understood us better than anybody did, he said quietly. The dog blinked slowly beside the fire. Near midnight, Walter reached the final pages. The ink looked uneven there, smudged in places. Winter is coming again. I do not know how much longer I can keep this place running alone. Another entry, the bank account, should last a little longer if I stretch supplies carefully. Walter sat up straighter. Bank account? He flipped forward. There, a folded receipt tucked between pages. Small local savings account. Opened under the cabin address years earlier. The amount wasn't huge, but enough to matter. Enough to keep the place alive for a while longer. Walter stared at the paper silently. Eleanor hadn't been hiding money for herself. She'd been trying to preserve the cabin after she was gone. as if she believed somebody might continue what she started. The thought unsettled him deeply. Outside, snow tapped softly against the windows. Walter rubbed both hands over his face. "You really expected somebody to come back here someday, didn't you?" The fire cracked sharply. Ranger lifted his head suddenly toward the front porch. Walter noticed the shift immediately. The dog stood, ears forward. No barking. That was worse. Walter killed the lantern and moved toward the window carefully. A shape stood near the edge of the clearing, barely visible through falling snow. Human. Watching the cabin again. Walter's pulse kicked hard. Old deployment instincts flooded back instantly. Slow breathing, controlled movement. Scan the tree line. Watch the hands. The figure didn't move closer, didn't speak, just stood there. Then headlights flickered briefly far below through the trees. An engine started. The silhouette disappeared into darkness almost immediately after. Walter stayed frozen beside the window several seconds longer. Ranger let out a low growl deep in his chest. "Yeah," Walter whispered. "They're still watching, but something inside him had changed now. A week ago, he would have packed the truck and left before dawn. Gone back to Missoula. Gone back to surviving instead of living. Now he looked around the cabin differently. At the patched walls, the old photographs, the journals stacked beside the fire. This place wasn't just land anymore. It was proof somebody once chose compassion over comfort. And the more Walter learned about Eleanor Hayes, the more he understood why that frightened certain people. He sat back down slowly and opened the journal again. Near the final page, one sentence had been underlined twice in fading ink. "If this place survives me, let it stay warm, for whoever still needs it." Walter stared at those words a long time. Then he reached down and scratched gently behind Ranger's ears. "You hear that, buddy?" Ranger leaned against his leg heavily. Walter looked toward the dark window once more. Snow continued falling across Bitterroot Ridge. Cold outside. Warm inside. And somewhere in between, Walter Hayes realized he had already made a decision he hadn't spoken out loud yet. He wasn't leaving. The next morning came sharp and blue across Bitterroot Ridge. Fresh snow glittered untouched beyond the porch rail, while smoke curled slowly from the chimney. Walter stood outside, splitting firewood, with stiff shoulders and sore hands. Ranger rested nearby, with his bandaged leg stretched out in the snow. The dog hated being inactive. Every few minutes he still tried to patrol the clearing before Walter ordered him back down again. "You're not bulletproof," Walter muttered. Ranger ignored him completely. By noon, the low growl of an engine rolled up the mountain road. Walter stopped mid-swing. A dark pickup climbed slowly into the clearing and parked near the cabin. Ben Calloway stepped out alone. No smile this time. Just cold air steaming around him while he buttoned his coat tighter. Walter leaned the axe against the chopping block, but didn't invite him closer. Ranger stood immediately. The fur along his neck rose slightly. Ben noticed. "Dog still doesn't like me," he said. "He's got good instincts." Ben let that pass. For a few seconds, both men simply looked at each other across the snow. Then, Ben reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "I came to make one last offer." Walter didn't move. Ben stepped closer and handed over the paper. The number inside made Walter blink despite himself. Enough money to clear debts. Enough to buy a decent place in town. Enough to stop worrying about rent, repairs, groceries, all of it. Walter folded the paper slowly. "That's a lot of money for one broken cabin." Ben exhaled through his nose. "It isn't the cabin." "What then?" "The road access behind your property matters to my company." Walter studied him carefully. "Or maybe it's the history attached to it." Ben's jaw tightened slightly at that. Snow drifted softly between them. Finally, Ben said, "You don't understand what reopening old wounds does to small towns." Walter gave a tired laugh. "No, I think I understand exactly that." Ben looked away toward the tree line. "My father worked that mine until the end," he said quietly. "People around here lost jobs overnight. Some lost homes. Everybody lost something. And Eleanor spent years trying to help people survive it." Ben nodded once. Yes, but not everyone thanked her for it. Walter folded the offer back into the envelope. "She gave away almost everything she had." "She embarrassed people," Ben replied. "There's a difference." The honesty of it sat ugly between them. Ben looked back at the cabin. "Take the offer, Walter. Go back to your life in Missoula." Walter stared at him. That wasn't much of a life. Ben hesitated. Maybe he heard something truthful there. Maybe he recognized it. "I know you think you're protecting her memory," Ben said finally. "But all you're really doing is dragging grief back into daylight." Walter looked down at Ranger beside him. The dog watched Ben without blinking. Then Walter handed the envelope back. "Not selling." Ben accepted it slowly. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Finally, Ben nodded once. "Then be careful." Walter frowned. "Is that a threat?" "No," Ben said quietly. "It's advice." The truck disappeared down the mountain soon after, leaving fresh tire tracks carved through the snow. Walter watched until the sound of the engine vanished completely. Ranger limped closer beside him. "You trust him?" Walter asked. The dog snorted softly and looked toward the woods instead. "Yeah," Walter muttered. "Me neither." That evening, snow started again, heavy this time. Wind scraped hard across the cabin roof while darkness swallowed the ridge earlier than usual. Walter reinforced the shed door before sunset and checked every window twice. The old habits came naturally now. Too naturally. Ranger paced the porch restlessly, despite the cold. Then sometime after 9, headlights flashed through the trees. Multiple vehicles. Walter froze instantly. Ranger barked hard. 3 trucks climbed into the clearing fast, tires spinning in snow. Music blasted from open windows. Voices, drunk voices. Walter stepped onto the porch just as 4 men stumbled out laughing. Young, mid-20s maybe, beer bottles in hand. One kicked snow against the porch steps. "Well, look who's still here," another shouted. Walter recognized one of them from town but couldn't remember the name. "What do you want?" Walter asked calmly. The tallest man pointed toward the cabin. "I heard you're trying to turn this place into some kind of shrine." Another laughed. "Town would have healed better if that old woman minded her own business back then." Ranger growled instantly. Walter stepped slightly forward. "Time to leave." The drunk man smirked. "Or what?" Walter felt his pulse start climbing, the old pressure behind his ribs, the dangerous kind. He forced his hands to stay loose at his sides. "I'm asking politely." A beer bottle smashed against the porch rail, suddenly. Ranger barked sharply. One of the men moved toward the steps too quickly. Ranger lunged down off the porch before Walter could stop him. The dog planted himself directly between Walter and the stranger. "Get your mutt away from me." The man swung his boot hard. The kick caught Ranger across the ribs. The dog yelped and staggered sideways into the snow. Something inside Walter snapped loose. Not rage exactly, something colder, faster. He crossed the porch in 2 steps and grabbed the man's jacket before anybody reacted. The others froze immediately. Walter shoved him backward into the truck, hard enough to rattle the door. "Touch my dog again," Walter said quietly, "and you'll regret climbing this mountain." His voice scared even him a little. Years of restraint barely held together underneath it. The drunk man's bravado disappeared instantly. Walter released him slowly. Nobody moved. Snow blew sideways through the clearing, while Ranger struggled back to his feet beside the porch. The tallest man finally muttered, "Let's go." Within seconds, the trucks backed down the road again, headlights vanishing into the storm. Silence rushed back over the ridge. Walter dropped to one knee beside Ranger immediately. "You hurt bad?" The dog leaned heavily into him but stayed standing. Walter ran careful hands along the ribs. "Bruised, maybe. Nothing broken." Still, guilt twisted through his stomach. "You shouldn't have had to do that," he whispered. Ranger pressed his nose against Walter's shoulder, like the whole thing hadn't mattered. Inside the cabin, Walter fed more wood into the fire, while Ranger curled stiffly beside the stove. The wind outside screamed through the pines. Walter sat at the kitchen table, staring at Eleanor's journal again. This place had sheltered desperate people once. Now it was making people angry all over again. Because memories were inconvenient. Because shame lasted longer than snow. Ranger lifted his head when Walter finally stood. "What?" Walter asked softly. The dog watched him carefully. Walter looked toward the dark window beyond the firelight. Then he nodded once to himself. "Tomorrow," he said quietly. Ranger's ears twitched. "Tomorrow I go into town, and I stop hiding this story." Outside, Bitterroot Ridge disappeared deeper into snow and darkness. But inside the old cabin, something steady had finally lit inside Walter Hayes. Not anger. Purpose. Walter barely slept that night. Not because of fear. Because once a man decides to stop running from something, his mind starts moving faster than his body can keep up. By dawn, the storm had passed. Fresh snow covered the ridge in clean white silence, while pale sunlight filtered through the pines. Ranger limped beside Walter across the porch, stubborn as ever despite bruised ribs. Walter crouched and checked him again. "You stay close today." Ranger blinked at him like that had never been in question. The church sat near the edge of town beside the frozen creek. Small. White paint peeling around the windows. Somebody had already shoveled a narrow path through the snow, leading to the front doors. Walter parked slowly. His hands tightened briefly around the steering wheel before he let go. Crowds still made him uneasy, always had since coming home. Too much noise, too many eyes. Ranger rested his head against Walter's arm for 1 second before climbing down from the truck. "Yeah," Walter muttered quietly. "I know." Inside, folding chairs lined the church basement beneath buzzing fluorescent lights. Maybe 20 people showed up at first. Mostly older locals. A few veterans. Miguel stood near the coffee table, pouring drinks into paper cups. He nodded once at Walter. "Didn't think you'd actually do it." "Neither did I." At the far side of the room, Ben Calloway stood near the wall with both hands buried inside his coat pockets. He looked exhausted. Not angry, just tired. Walter noticed several people glance toward him and then quickly away. Same reaction he'd been getting since arriving in town. Like nobody knew whether he was digging up history or disturbing a grave. Ranger settled beneath Walter's chair immediately after they sat down. Calm, alert, the pastor cleared his throat near the front of the room. Walter asked if he could share something regarding Eleanor Hayes and the mine fire years. Silence spread fast after that name. Walter stood slowly. His chest tightened the way it always did before speaking in front of strangers. For 1 stupid second, he almost sat back down again. Then Ranger shifted against his boots. Steady. Walter took a breath. "I didn't come here to accuse anybody," he said quietly. "And I'm not trying to shame this town." Nobody moved. Snow tapped softly against the basement windows. Walter placed Eleanor's notebook carefully on the table beside him. "When I first came up to the cabin," he continued, I planned to sell it immediately. A few people nodded slightly at that. But I started finding things my grandmother left behind. Letters, photographs, names. He opened the notebook slowly. She spent years helping families after the mine fire. Families who had nowhere else to go. Still silence. Then an older woman near the back finally spoke. She fed my cousins that winter. Every head turned toward her. The woman looked nervous immediately after speaking, but she kept going. We lost our trailer after the fire spread through worker housing. Eleanor let us stay up there near 3 weeks. Walter nodded once toward her. Another man cleared his throat beside the wall. She brought blankets to my mother, he muttered, without looking up. The room shifted slightly after that. Not warmth exactly, but movement. People remembering out loud for the first time in years. Walter laid several photographs across the table. Children standing outside the cabin. Families crowded together near the porch. Snow stacked waist-high behind them. She wasn't causing trouble, Walter said. She was trying to keep people alive. Ben finally stepped forward from the wall. My father knew safety inspections were being ignored at the mine, he said quietly. The room went still again. Ben swallowed hard before continuing. He wasn't the owner, but he knew conditions were bad near the old housing units. Miguel crossed his arms silently nearby. Ben looked around the room, and when the fire happened, he paused. People panicked. Jobs disappeared overnight. Nobody wanted blame attached to the town. Walter watched him carefully. Ben looked older suddenly, smaller too. My father spent the rest of his life trying not to talk about it, he admitted. Most folks did. An older veteran sitting near the coffee station spoke next. That's how shame works. Nobody argued with him. Walter rested one hand against the notebook. Eleanor got blamed because she kept reminding people what happened. The pastor lowered his eyes slowly. Ranger shifted beneath Walter's chair, but stayed calm despite the crowded room and constant movement. Walter noticed his own breathing slowing because of it. The dog grounded him without effort. A woman near the front wiped tears from her face quietly. I used to think Eleanor hated this town, she whispered. Walter shook his head. No, I think she loved it enough to stay when everybody else gave up. The words settled deep. Nobody spoke for several long seconds after that. Then Ben reached into his coat pocket slowly. Walter stiffened instinctively before realizing it was only a folded piece of paper. Ben placed it carefully on the table. My father wrote this before he died, he said. Never sent it anywhere. Walter unfolded it carefully. A short, handwritten statement. An apology. Not legal, not dramatic. Just a tired old man admitting he stayed silent because he feared losing everything. Walter looked back up at Ben. You kept this all these years? Ben nodded once. I wasn't proud of him, but I understood him. Outside, wind pushed snow softly across the church windows. Inside, something heavy finally started loosening after decades. Not forgiveness exactly, something quieter. Recognition, truth without spectacle. Walter looked around the room slowly. These people, Eleanor, helped, he said. They mattered. That's all I'm asking anybody here to remember. The older woman in the back stood shakily from her chair. Without saying anything, she walked toward Walter and placed an old brass key into his palm. He frowned. What is this? She smiled sadly. Storage shed behind the old church pantry. Eleanor kept supplies there during the winters. Her eyes watered slightly. She used to say the cabin would help people again someday. Walter stared at the key silently. Ranger rested his head against Walter's leg. The room no longer felt hostile now, only tired, like a place finally exhaling after holding its breath too long. When the meeting ended, People didn't rush out immediately. Some stayed looking through photographs. Others spoke quietly among themselves. Ben approached Walter near the doorway, while snow drifted outside beneath yellow streetlights. "You were right not to sell," he admitted. Walter studied him carefully. Ben glanced down at Ranger. "I don't think your grandmother would have wanted the place erased." For the first time since they'd met, Walter believed him. Not completely, but enough. As Walter stepped outside into the freezing evening air, Ranger walked tightly beside him through fresh snow. The town looked different now, still scarred, still complicated, but less silent. Walter glanced down at the brass key resting in his hand, then toward the mountains rising dark beyond town. Somewhere up there sat an old cabin filled with memories nobody wanted anymore. Except now, for the first time in decades, the truth inside it no longer belonged to just one dead woman. It belonged to the people who survived because of her. Winter stayed on Bitterroot Ridge, another 6 weeks after the church meeting. Snow buried the narrow mountain road so deep some mornings. Walter had to shovel a path just to reach the truck. The old generator failed twice. Pipes froze once in the kitchen wall. Ranger limped more during cold nights, though he still insisted on making his rounds around the cabin before bed. Walter stopped arguing with him about it. Some habits mattered too much. The strange thing was this. Walter no longer woke every morning wondering how to leave. Now he woke thinking about repairs, about insulation, about fixing the broken railing near the porch before somebody slipped next winter. That thought alone would have sounded insane a few months earlier. One afternoon, Miguel arrived in his RV carrying scrap lumber tied down with old rope. "You planning to stand there staring?" he grunted. "Or help me unload this?" Walter laughed for the first time in days, a real laugh. Not forced. The sound surprised even him. They spent hours rebuilding shelves inside the storage room, Eleanor once used for blankets and canned food. Ranger followed behind them the entire time, tail moving slowly, as sawdust floated through thin beams of sunlight. Little by little, the cabin changed. Not into something fancy, just useful. The kind of place where tired people could breathe for a night without being asked too many questions. Ben Calloway sent gravel for the road after spring thaw started. Never mentioned payment. A widow from town brought old cookware. The pastor donated spare cots from the church basement. Somebody repaired the water pump anonymously. Walter stopped trying to figure out who. People helped differently when shame finally loosened its grip. One evening, Walter found himself sitting alone on the porch watching fog drift through the pines while Ranger rested nearby. The mountain air smelled like wet earth now instead of snow. Spring coming slowly. Walter rubbed tired hands together and looked toward the valley lights far below. For years after Afghanistan, silence had felt dangerous. Too quiet meant waiting. Waiting meant trouble. But the silence here felt different now. Not empty. Peaceful. Ranger lifted his head suddenly at the sound of tires climbing the road. Walter stood automatically before catching himself. Old reflex. An old pickup finally rolled into view carrying a young woman and 2 small kids. The woman stepped out looking embarrassed. "Sorry," she said. "Pastor Reed told us. Maybe somebody here could help for a night or two." Walter glanced toward Miguel, who simply shrugged from the doorway. "Well," Miguel muttered, "guess word travels fast." The woman explained her furnace failed down in town. Repairs wouldn't happen until morning. Motel money had run out already. Walter looked toward the cabin behind him. Warm lights glowed softly through the windows. The same cabin he once planned to sell before winter even ended. He nodded toward the porch. "Come inside before those kids freeze." The little boy noticed Ranger immediately. "Can I pet him?" Walter looked down at the old shepherd. Ranger walked forward slowly, patient despite age and sore joints. The boy wrapped both arms around his neck without fear. Ranger accepted it like he'd been waiting for the job his whole life. That night, the cabin sounded different, not lonely. The kids laughed, while Miguel burned grilled cheese sandwiches in the kitchen. The woman cried quietly once while talking on the phone outside, thinking nobody noticed. Walter noticed. He just understood sometimes dignity meant pretending not to. Later, long after everyone went to sleep, Walter remained awake beside the wood stove. Ranger lay near the door, keeping watch like always. Walter stared into the fire for a long time, then finally spoke softly into the quiet room. "You knew before I did, didn't you?" Ranger opened one eye slightly. Walter smiled faintly. "Yeah, figures. Because maybe the dog had known from the start. Known this place was never supposed to be sold, only continued." Spring arrived hard and sudden after that. Snow melted down the mountain in roaring streams. Mud covered the roads. The valley turned green again. Walter repaired the porch roof using leftover lumber from Ben's mill. Miguel painted the old mailbox. Someone from town carved a wooden sign by hand. "Eleanor Hayes Rest Stop." Nothing fancy, just simple letters burned into pine. On the morning they hung the sign near the road, nearly a dozen people showed up to help without being asked. Walter stood off to the side holding a coffee cup while watching them work. Neighbors, veterans, people who once avoided even speaking Eleanor's name. Now her story lived openly in their hands. The widow from church placed flowers near the porch. Ben repaired the final broken fence post himself. Miguel sat on the cabin steps smoking quietly, while Ranger stretched out beside him in warm sunlight. Older now, gray spreading around his muzzle, but peaceful. The pastor approached Walter near the porch railing. "You did something good here." Walter looked toward the cabin, toward the people inside laughing over burned coffee and cheap pie. Then toward Ranger. The old shepherd had his head resting across his paws, eyes half closed while children played nearby. Walter shook his head slowly. "No," he said softly. "She did." That evening, after everyone left, the mountain finally grew quiet again. But not the same kind of quiet. Warm quiet, the kind filled with distant voices drifting from inside the cabin. Walter sat down on the porch steps beside Ranger, while sunset painted the ridge gold and deep blue. The shepherd leaned heavily against his leg. Walter scratched slowly behind his ears. "You tired, old man." Ranger gave a lazy thump of his tail. Below them, the valley lights flickered alive one by one. For years, Walter Hayes had survived by keeping the world at arm's length. No attachments, no expectations, no reasons to stay anywhere too long. But now there was a cabin behind him, with lights glowing through the windows. A place people could find when they ran out of options. A place Eleanor protected long before him. And beside him rested the dog that had carried him through every dark mile back home. Walter looked out across Bitterroot Ridge, one last time as cold evening air rolled through the trees. Then he rested his hand gently on Ranger's back and listened to the sound coming from inside the cabin. Laughter, plates clattering, voices, life. And for the first time in a very long while, Walter no longer felt like a man hiding from the world. He felt like somebody who had finally come home. Maybe that's the real thing this story was trying to say all along. Not every hero stands in front of cameras. Not every act of kindness gets remembered when it happens. Sometimes the people who carry others through the hardest winters are the very people a town forgets first. Eleanor gave people warmth when nobody else wanted the burden. Walter almost walked away from that same responsibility because pain had convinced him nothing good was waiting for him anymore. But healing didn't come from revenge. It didn't come from winning a fight or exposing some giant secret. It came slowly, through trust, through staying, through one old cabin keeping its lights on for people who needed a place to breathe. And maybe Ranger understood that before anyone else did. Because dogs never care much about pride or reputation. They care about who's hurting and who still needs somebody beside them. If this story meant something to you, leave a 1 in the comments. And if you think people like Eleanor still exist out there, quietly helping others without recognition, leave a 0. And if you'd like to hear more stories about loyalty, second chances, veterans, and the animals that help carry them home, you're always welcome here. Until next time, stay safe out there.